Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is week 3 of class. This is a week, kind of like first week, right? We kind of got into like what is sociology, background in sociology, thinking about kind of defining or more processing a sociology of race, class, and gender. Talk about kind of systems of privilege, disadvantage, the matrix of domination, bring those ideas forward. Last week spent time in the space of the social construction of race, thinking about distinguishing between biological notions of race to social construction of race, why that was important, kind of the influence of the biological component of race, reinforcing institutional inequalities, systems of oppression, systems of advantage were predicated upon ideas of biological race. So anyway, unpackaging a lot of stuff there. So this week we are moving into an examination of whiteness, of white identity. And so kind of walk through some different conceptual components of thinking about whiteness. We'll kind of start off with that, provide some different examples and illustrations, talk a little bit about an idea of the good white liberal, sort of the difference between a white liberal versus a white ally, sort of making a distinction there. And the goal and the hope would be to understand issues of identity development around race, of how that might be different for a member of the dominant group versus a subordinate group. Our place within the social order influences how we develop our ideas, our identity around particular areas. So we kind of like unpackage all this kind of stuff. It's an important part because if we're thinking about, how the world is organized, how the world is kind of, the social structures and institutions and culture, how it's organized, and our place within that structure, we have to be able to account for and understand the influence of race in that particular structure and organization. And that includes racial identity of members of the dominant group, as well as the subordinate group. So with no further ado, kind of get started and kind of walk through some different components of white identity development. Let's start off with this quote. It's a pretty powerful one. James Baldwin, an African-American literary giant from the 1950s, 1960s, really a strong voice in terms of thinking about the Black experience, thinking about the racial hierarchy, the racial structure in the United States. And this particular quote, I think, is pretty powerful. It's a good way to start off kind of this conversation or examination of whiteness. White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. Martin Luther King also had another statement. I could have put that in here as well, is about this idea about self-love. Justice comes from a place of self-love. And there's we could spend a whole lot of time talking about this particular idea. I find it really powerful and fascinating and interesting. To think about division and separation and oppression are not possible when individuals in positions are not possible when individuals are engaged in self-love, where they understand self, they understand ideas of self, they understand kind of who they are, that it's not in us in terms of our human character or human nature to facilitate, maintain, work towards creating injustice. That we do that work of facilitating injustice based on neglect to the self, neglectful understanding of self-identity and development, and a lack of regard for self-love and self-care. So an appreciation for the humanity of others comes from a place of self-love. When we don't have that kind of component of self-love, or we're not socialized or encouraged to examine that, we can fall into reinforcing all kinds of inequities without even really knowing we're doing that. So anyway, it's kind of just a way to sort of start off this sort of conversation of where we might be headed. Near the end of the lecture, just kind of like, you have different summary points for the video lectures. There's One of them I want you to talk about this week, and there's a link to a video at the end of this lecture, and it's a discussion, conversation that me and a colleague, Ken Ruckers, had with two of our librarians about decolonization of the library. And I think you take a lot of the different elements that we talk about today and provide a really powerful sort of example about how institutions are not neutral. And maybe we think that they are neutral, but they're shaped by the culture and the environment in which they take place in. So if race and gender and other inequities or other issues are going on in culture, they're going to be embedded in our institutions. And this is an interesting kind of conversation and example of how an institution is really not a neutral space, and some of the danger and some of the pitfalls, and thinking if we ignore the ways in which institutions may be reinforcing particular ideologies, beliefs, and perspectives. Okay, so we're going to examine privilege. Well, how do we know that privilege exists? We can start off with like male privilege. How do we know that male privilege exists? And you can think about that for a while. We could look at all the way from institutional level discrimination, advantage, cultural assumptions about gender that privilege the male identity and male position. We can think about individual, all the way from the micro level, individual prejudices, individual attitudes, all the way through, through socialization, about kind of encouraging and moving in different directions in terms of fields and occupations, which leads to, economic independence or economic security, all these different kind of things that we could examine when we're looking at how do we know that male privilege exists. But also look at, in terms of being heterosexual, that heterosexuality, how do we know that heterosexuality, how does that privilege exist? Again, we could look at laws and institutions and go all the way down to the micro level. We could look at schools. We could look at how schools and teachers and kind of we create environments of either supporting individuals from who are, heterosexual, individuals who are gay, lesbian, transgender, queer, just sort of how do institutions kind of respond to and provide support for individuals of different gender and sexual identities. And then finally, we could look at, how do we know that white privilege exists? And the reason I kind of put these three here is because I think we can, there's been a longer history, of engaging in that, of looking at gender discrimination. And there's less hostility, less fragility is a term we kind of could use for this week, as some of the readings kind of engage in with D'Angelo's work on white fragility. There's less fragility there. Less defensiveness, less hostility towards examining gender inequity. It's still there in our culture. I wouldn't say it's removed, but it's less, there's more openness. Also in terms of sexual orientation, it's really interesting. I think one analysis I've developed over the years is if you could look at the amount of social change regarding same-sex relations and same-sex protections in terms of legal protections, public attitudes towards same-sex relations, and the amount of change over the course of a couple decades has been really fundamentally transformative. It's late 1960s, the formation of the modern day gay rights movement. So you're talking about 40, 50 years of a huge amount of change in a short amount of time. Not to ignore that there's not continued problems and other things to address in terms of gender and sexual relations, but a lot of transformation has happened. Now, race is sticky. Change has happened, but it's been more difficult, it's been more challenging, and I would say more limited in a way as well, more threatening to white domination and white power. So I think, examining white privilege is going to be a different examination than looking at other areas of privilege and advantage. I think there's more awareness and more openness and more allyship going on in the white community today. You can see that in terms of Black Lives Matter movement, the number of white individuals who are white, who are out protesting, marching, demanding a voice, examining change, do not view looking at whiteness through a lens of, they view it from a place of self-love and self-care versus a sense of like, I'm not going there, I'm not examining that particular component of who I am. So let's kind of talk about systems of privilege. Domination and privilege are linked. We kind of talked about it before, the matrix of domination, and we can bring in intersectionality as well. That not only when we talk about race and also class matter, right? So a person, a white male middle class, white male working class, white male upper class, white female upper class, a Latino from a working class, a Latino from the professional class. I mean, all these different ways that we could link these intersectional kind of components are important. At the same time, we have to be aware that we're not diluting things, that we're sometimes that race is the dominant framework. It is the dominant status position that we're looking at, regardless of an individual's class, gender, sexual identity, and other areas of identity. That race may be the master status that we talk about in terms of sociological thinking. Prior to the 1970s, the focus was on, from the 1970s before, I'd say, the focus was really on the groups who were being dominated, systems of disadvantage, looking at minority groups, looking at subordinate groups. I mean, the focus of scholarship and attention was focused there. There was less attention focused, there was none, but there was less attention focused on the dominant group, or the privileged group, the group that has an invisible package of unearned assets. I remember McIntosh defining privilege as this sort of invisible knapsack of provisions and maps, that there is something going on there, that it's invisible, that the dominant group oftentimes is not aware in which the world is structured in ways that reinforce their own position of advantage. Largely taught not to see it, to ignore it, to see things as being either race neutral, which is going to get us into that space of being unconscious of the way that race actually is structured into the social world. And sometimes a dominant group have difficulty recognizing their dominant position, their unearned advantage. Part of our culture helps to make that difficulty possible, to view the world through a lens of individual achievement versus, get to reconcile that there's been a individual accomplishment, and at the same time, maybe institutional advantage going on from the dominant group. To bring about change in this particular system, that has to come from individual level, the micro level, that has to be linked to the structural level. And this becomes the great challenge, because individuals that are in positions of privilege, to create a more equal system, equality of opportunity, equality of distribution of resources, to be really democratic, to call upon our democratic principles, our liberal principles. So liberal in this case of thinking about the freedoms and rights, protections, like these are all liberal kind of notions of the individual freedoms and individual rights to non-discrimination. That to make that happen, the dominant group is going to have to lose privilege to make that happen. So the dominant group is going to unconsciously or consciously want to protect their particular position. Let me give you a quick example. It was probably, I don't know, I want to say 8 years ago here in Bend, a conversation about redrawing school district boundaries, and that happens every once in a while. The community's growing, so got to draw the boundaries for what kids are going to be going to what schools. It seems like a good white liberal kind of community that we are in. Like a lot of individuals in the community are, and there are a lot who are representing ideas of racial justice and racial equity, who get that, who understand that, who are advocating for that. Even if that means losing privilege and advantage of their own particular group. There are some in the community who, we'll talk about this sort of idea of a good white liberal, who were threatened by the idea that the district boundaries are going to be redrawn, and that their kids were going to be going to a school in the community that had a higher rate of students of color, a different social class composition within that particular school. And the write-ins in the paper were just like, whoa, it just kind of blew my mind. I knew it was there, but just to be astonished at how direct and forward individuals were about wanting to make sure their kids got into the right school, the best school, the way that they saw that the best school, right? They saw that predominantly white schools were the better schools. And Mike, I would surmise, guess that these individuals would not see themselves as holding on to any racial hostility, that they view themselves as being racially progressive, perhaps. But they thought it was unfair that these school boundaries are being redrawn in this particular way. And to me, it's like a powerful sort of demonstration that privileged groups are going to sometimes try to work to maintain that privilege and advantage. And sometimes, in this case, I'm using, it's this perception they have that particular schools are going to be less good than other schools. So it's not even the reality, it's just sort of this perception of things that are going on. Kind of another example, just sort of think about, like colleges and universities, common to have a Black student union, Native American clubs and organizations and institutions for support, Latinx community, LGBTQ plus community organizations for support. And they come because of the historical marginalization of those groups and those institutions. Sometimes white students may have, or individuals who are white may have, I think this is more common in the past, but it's still there today, wonder why, or react to, or respond to, why is there not a white student union, for example? And that has a lot to do with defensiveness, a lot to do with misunderstanding, lack of examination in terms of race and race in the social world. It comes from a place of reaction and defensiveness versus engagement. I think there's a lot more conversation going on today, teaching tolerance, gear a lot of material towards K through 12 education, and that, focus on anti-racist education. And here in Ben Lapine School District, actually working more and more in that direction, develop anti-racist curriculum. So it's not just being, we're going to be race neutral or be colorblind in terms of racial curriculum, that the only way to move towards a more equitable future is by developing an anti-racist education, to understand how race is structured in the world and to work towards creating a system that's more racially just. An interesting example, thinking about, Harvard and discrimination, just colleges in general and college admissions processes. And there's been a lot of debate and discussion over the years about what components of an admissions process can colleges engage in? What components are addressing race? Can colleges look at race? Can race be a factor in terms of college admissions? And there was a case filed recently. Last couple of years went through the U.S. Supreme Court, came to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's basically whether or not Asian Americans are being discriminated against by Harvard and other institutions. The interesting backstory to that particular court case is that it was organized by a long time opponent of race and college admissions. And the race and college, and it was from a white lawyer who's got a long history of antagonism towards college admissions and looking at race and college admissions. And the belief was that if they filed a case in which Asian Americans were being discriminated against, they would gather more traction because of these sort of cultural notions about Asian Americans of being, about their academic preparedness, their devotion to school and education and those kind of things. So it's this ways in which, the system is being maintained. There's watchdogs, I guess, let me kind of back up, watchdogs in the system to make sure that privilege continues to maintain and happen. And when it's being challenged, that there are those who are working to maintain the kind of the existing social order. And and that takes the participation also of the general public as well. I mean, it could be like a reaction without understanding more, diving into affirmative action and college admissions to think about, yeah, it's not fair, right? So there could be a reaction of, well, it's not fair. Asian Americans should not be discriminated against, without fully understanding kind of the history and development of affirmative action, college admissions, looking at the ways in which white advantage happens within those institutions, privilege happens within those institutions, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. So the point I'm sort of getting at is that our identities in terms of racial identities are an important part of thinking about these particular systems and these particular ideas. And so this gets into our identities, of who we are. So part of the way we develop our identities, we develop it through socialization, with that we are all socialized in this world and we are shaped by, by families, the media, I provide a lot of different examples here, different places in which we are shaping our identities. it's impossible not to have an identity around gender. I mean, it's just, we live in a social world that constructs ideas around gender. We recognize that males are a member of the dominant group, that males have a gendered identity. To challenge gender inequality is going to require that males are participating in that that we're aware of constructions of a male identity. That has to be part of that discussion, and also part of that discussion the way that patriarchy is sort of shaping the ways in which males and females, individuals who develop ideas of gender, and how those are shaping the identities and lived experience and opportunities and future of individuals. The same is true as race. It's impossible not to have an identity around race. And this becomes really fascinating to sort of examine that historically, I don't think whites spend a lot of time examining their own idea in terms of their white identity. Whites have a racial identity. An idea that, this belief that whites do not have one, or I don't have a racial identity, I'm race neutral, it's impossible. It cannot happen. Whites have a racial identity. And there's the work of, I'm thinking of the work of Sullivan right now about her kind of conversation she started thinking about when she started, she's a white academic who's interested in basically identity development. She's a philosopher, and she's interested in the ways we come to know and understand self and other. And she got into sort of like thinking about gender identity, and then that led her into thinking about, gender socialization. And then she started thinking about race socialization. And she never thought about, she sort of tells a story, she never really thought about how is she going to socialize her daughter in terms of whiteness? Like, she got that in terms of, she started thinking about, well, how am I going to socialize my kid in terms of understanding gender? But she didn't approach that, thinking about race in the same way and thinking about socialization. And to me, and for her, that was really powerful when she had that recognition, that she recognized that her own racial identity, she never really fully examined. And because she didn't examine that, she didn't know how to engage in that work in terms of socialization with her own daughter, in terms of white racial identity and development. And then in White Fragility, you get this sort of quote, comes from that article you're reading for this week. Thinking about our racial frames may be really hard for white people because whites are taught that to have a racial viewpoint is biased. Unfortunately, this protects the biases because denying them ensures that we won't change them. And I think you get a lot of powerful stuff from White Fragility in this particular readings for this week. Okay, we think about it. We can think about racism. We think about structured inequality at different levels, the individual all the way to the structural level, institutional and structural. So the individual, institutional, think about it like education, legal system, all the way to structural, kind of, which is more interlocking, interrelated, kind of logic and processes and things that are structural level. So here's some just definitional qualities in thinking about racism. It's prejudice, it's the attitude, plus it's the social component, plus it's the institutional. So it's the prejudice, the individual disposition and prejudices. It's the social component, the interpersonal, the group level, it's all the way to the institutional. And there probably should be arrows drawing all directions there, not just plus, but interrelated. System advantage and system of disadvantage. So both of those are going on. Those two are linked. Founded on ideas of white supremacy and white supremacy arranged. Oftentimes we think about white supremacy through a lens of we think about the KKK, or we think about white nationalist groups. And that's one level of white supremacy. White supremacy can be very, it's participating in systems that are reproducing white supremacy and engaged in that without even knowing it. That's also sort of white supremacy as well. So it doesn't take the form that we oftentimes just think about it as sort of this real extreme form of white nationalism. It could be more common, everyday, kind of lower level, so to speak, kind of stuff. Racism is grounded in history. It's grounded in historical relationships of power. And it's been the past, it's in the present, it's going to be in the future. The question is, how engaged are we in making change? It's embedded in our institutions, it's embedded in our culture to the point where it becomes taken for granted in a way. That things like affirmative action get taken for granted. Like we don't understand the history, the background, the connection between those policies and sort of their goals and their objectives and sort of the realities in terms of how they work. That we develop ideas of preconceived notions about particular things, and the world becomes taken for granted, and that we don't challenge some of the assumptions that go along with that. And finally, sort of micro to the macro level. I don't know if to spend too much time here, but thinking about, we already talked a little bit about this, this sort of that interconnection, privilege and domination, these 4 areas of power that are related, the structural level, thinking about the institutional level, the disciplinary level. So the ways in which we are being regulated, controlled, and shaped. That could happen through the mass media. It could happen through social sanctions, the ways in which, we are being disciplined in terms of this particular system. Hegemonic, so domination sort of by consent, that the ways in which we are reinforcing, all of us potentially are reinforcing these kind of systems of oppression and disadvantage and advantage, becomes very hegemonic, the ideologies and beliefs that get sort of ingrained in culture itself. Okay, that's sort of, more likely dominant group views things as being neutral. Dominant group often doesn't recognize things. And we need rationalism to be able to challenge the social order. We need the empirical, but also need the rational. We need to understand kind of our own self-identity and development, as well as others, group members of the dominant group, the subordinate group, understand just sort of how to think about humans as a larger group and think about what is it that the ways in which how do we systematically understand, how did we kind of create this kind of world that we live in? I mean, usually in our critical thinking and evaluation versus always basing things on sort of empirical data. Okay, so I mean, here's an example of approaching things with the lens of rationalism, right? So going back to college admissions, like as I mentioned, a lot of history in terms of like, what is the role of race in terms of college admissions? Can institutions provide some advantage? Some advantage for individuals who belong to a disadvantaged racial group? Can institutions be race conscious? Is where race conscious sort of using race as a factor, but not a determining factor. That's kind of been where it's moved to over the years. Super interesting that, that discussion. And one thing that's often left out of that discussion is the areas of privilege, that there's also legacy status, that individuals who have family members who went to that particular institution get a leg up. That's not based on merit, that's based on privilege and advantage. And that's rarely talked about. It's talked about more today, but that's rarely talked about. If I put on my sort of lens of critical thinking and rationalism, I'm kind of trying to unpackage that. So if the goal was like, the response to race-based college admissions and race-conscious based, and there's a reaction to that seems unfair. Well, this is not part of the discussion about how legacy status is not unfair too. There's a disconnect. There's something going on there that is irrational, illogical. And it has to be reconciled in a way, like how can you justify one versus the other? And I think it's kind of a really powerful and interesting example, because college and institutions are a gateway to wealth and income and positions of power and leadership. Okay, the macro and the micro level, sort of linking those connections. To reinforce this particular system, the dominant group has to be involved in its own reinforcement. The whites live and work in the communities and the workforce and sort of the family, sort of the community and the family. And in all those different places, to maintain a racial order or maintain any social order requires the dominant group to be participating in that. And there can be this idea what Sullivan talks about in her book, Good White Liberals. There's good white liberals, sometimes individuals, they identify themselves as being a good white person. A good white person is a person who comes from the middle class, holds on particular moral positions and ideas. Somebody who's a good white liberal, they distinguish themselves from the bad white people. So identifying themselves in terms of, I'm about racial progress. I'm about supporting racial equality. But that stops when it comes at the point of taking action or being an ally. So it's only wearing it on one sleeve becomes the idea, for this idea that Sullivan has, that a good white liberal is an individual who's identifying themselves as a good white liberal to communicate basically a virtue or a position, but they're not really engaged in the work of trying to understand and bring about change. Good white liberals view others as the problem versus the ways in which they may be participating in the system that's reinforcing that. White liberalism, so Sullivan states that white liberalism generally doesn't aim to end white domination, opposite to make it more tolerable to beneficiaries and victims. So when there's tough conversations that need to be had within institutions, I mean, whites are needed, the dominant group needs to be part of those sort of discussions. White allies need to be part of that particular discussion to make it less tolerable and make it more just. And individuals, what Sullivan talking about is sort of white liberals kind of embrace the ideas of racial equality, but it stops short when it comes time to put the rubber to the road and sort of put a call to action, or to raise one's voice within institutions, or to address those inequities that are there. I'm going to pass over this particular idea about cultural capital. Maybe it'll come up later on in the term. We don't really need it for right now. To kind of continue on with Sullivan's work, this idea of good white people, this sort of, it marks a boundary between self and other. So racism occurs over here. It's in the South. It's among the uneducated. It's among that particular group. I'm not like that particular group. That's a lot of this sort of good white people stuff that Sullivan is super interested in and trying to examine, of the othering that goes on within the white community itself, to distinguish the good white people from the bad white people. And it's the good white people who are identifying themselves in that particular way. But sometimes it's the good white people, the white liberals, in thought, white liberals in terms of in what they state they advocate for. But sometimes the white liberals are not the white ally who, she makes this distinction. The ally is an individual who is seeking to bring about change, seeking to make remedies, seeking to understand. It's more than just about identifying oneself as being progressive racially, but rather making a pathway of change. And that change, could be overwhelming thinking about it at sort of the macro level, but thinking about sort of the more micro level within family, within community, within, just how we interact with each other, how, if somebody provides some statement or a comment or a joke that's reinforcing racial inequities, it's the ability to have a voice and to be able to advocate, and the ability to represent values that are moving towards greater racial equity. Good white people, sometimes this is Sullivan's work, and she identifies that one component of a good white liberal is to demonize the past, to minimize the role of racism in contemporary society. To be able to look at things like, oh, that was more problematic in the past, versus thinking about how race is problematic today and how it may be, things have changed, but things remain the same too. I mean, the way that which white supremacy operates today is different than in the past, but it's still embedded in our institutions and in our culture in very powerful ways. And then sometimes good white people, from what Sullivan talks about, they embrace this idea of color blindness, to advocate that I don't see race, I just see people, that race is no longer a part, or it's not a significant problem today. This attempt to be neutral versus to be specific and to be race specific versus being neutral. And to be race specific requires understanding one's own racial identity and development. This is a really interesting book. This is her work's a little bit, I'm not sure her work's dated, but the book came out a couple decades ago, Beverly Tatum, talking about why there was a conversation going on in schools, K through 12, about, well, what's going on? Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And there was a move by teachers and administrators to kind of break the tables up and to force integration between the whites and Black students. And Tatum in her book goes through and talks about like that approach while it may have been well intended by the administrators, was very problematic. That the Black kids were sitting together because it was a place for support for themselves, because they were in an institution that needed to have a place of social support, a place to tell their own stories, a place that they could be with others who are having similar experiences to them in their institutions. I mean, they're friends and their friends and their peers, people they could identify with. And the institution should be supporting that versus trying to do this other thing of like forcing forcing integration in the cafeteria. But in her book, the reason I bring this up, her book up, in her book, she talks about the development. She's a psychologist. She's a developmental psychologist. That's her background, and she focuses on, many chapters on white identity development and the process of white identity development versus Black identity development versus people of different racial groups and identity development. And it makes a lot of sense, right? So our identities are developed in in the social world. Whether you are if you're in the dominant social group or a subordinate social group, the ways in which you develop identity are going to be fundamentally different. And white allies dive into parts of their racial identity to understand not only one's own racial identity, but coming from a place of understanding it in order to be an advocate for change. So an ally is engaged in the work of bringing about productive social change. And to do that requires examination of one's own racial identity. It requires from the micro level all the way to the macro level about how race is embedded within society itself. And also white allies have formed some alliance with people of color to advocate for racial justice. And also, when this is important, to work within one's own racial group. So white allies working within their own network of individuals to bring about social change. And finally, to act in one's position to address the inequalities, the oppressive levels, as well as the privilege, and to be an advocate for social change. So kind of provide an example here, maybe trying to of a white liberal versus a white ally kind of a component. So for example, here's a scenario that, let's say COCC is hiring a faculty member in the social sciences department. Let's say there's 6 finalists for the position, 5 white candidates, 1 person of color. All of them are equally qualified. All of them have equal job qualifications, job history. I would advocate that the institution hires the person of color for this particular position for a variety of reasons. One is recognizing the racial demographics of our student population. We do have students of color. To have more faculty of color is representing, trying to provide better representation of our reflection of our student population. Also, having individuals, people of color in positions of faculty positions, positions of leadership in institutions are very powerful symbolic communications in terms of how an institution, the values that it embraces, not only, I guess, from that level, the values that are embraced by the institution, and also at sort of the practical level of the different perspectives that individuals offer and bring forward are beneficial to an organization. Providing, that kind of an environment and a perspective that, we're honoring, respecting, and embracing, providing more perspectives within our field of social sciences to be able to come at things from different perspectives and ideas and histories. So for those reasons and others, to support that. Now, that's more of a white ally position. A white liberal position say, well, may kind of get a little feathers ruffled a little bit about that, and view that, well, everyone should be treated equal. And it's like, well, they're all equally qualified, but we have an underrepresented population. This would be the white ally response. We have an underrepresented population within our community of faculty, and that we need to do fundamentally a much more effective job of both recruiting and maintaining employment among faculty of color at our institution. The other thing I'd sort of offer there from a more white ally position too is that there's so many different ways in which the white candidates have had advantage over applicants of color throughout not only the application process, but the history before the application process. So there's a lot of history that it's like to see these candidates from a larger historical perspective, I think is an important part too. And then finally, is the conversation. I want you to watch this video. It's about a 20-minute video thinking about the library as non-neutral space. And one of your talking points for this week to talk about kind of this idea of the library as a non-neutral space, and think about some of the things that that I brought forward in this lecture of how it relates to the conversation with the librarians. All right. It's a lot to unpackage. I appreciate all you do. Do me a favor, if you have any questions, bring them up into class. If you have questions, other people do too. If you want to talk about very specific things, if you have, you want to provide a critique, that's fine too. Anything you bring forward is good. It's good for the group. So bring those ideas forward. I appreciate it. All right. Have a good day.